Welcome to my book list. I'm Lawrence, and today I thought it would be fun to name all of my favorite authors from A to Z, and just one author per letter of the alphabet. So I'll be talking about some of the runners up, but why I eventually chose the author in question, as well as one book recommendation from each of those top authors. And yeah, as usual, if you've seen my videos before, you can expect a focus on literary fiction and speculative fiction because those are my favorite genres. And I try to avoid nonfiction just because you can really get into it with the essayists and philosophers. So this is just more focusing on fiction authors, short stories, novellas, novels, and hopefully you can add some new authors to your reading list as well as some reminders of some old classics. This video is going to be in two parts just because talking about 26 different letters of my favorite authors and choosing them is a bit of a stretch. So please enjoy this first half of the alphabet and all these authors, and please click like and subscribe, and I'll be back in the next week or two with the rest of the alphabet and even more great book recommendations and authors. And please feel free, as always, to add your own in the comments and argue with me, because this is a very personal and subjective list, what you really want to get out of literature and what's really fun to revisit. So let's start with the A's, which is one of the harder ones that I had to do along with B's, but you've got some really perennial candidates in here. You have Chinua Achebe, whose Things Fall Apart trilogy I read last year and absolutely loved. You've got the Canadian author and legend Margaret Atwood, who's both a poet and a novelist, though she's not necessarily my favorite at either. We'll get into that for Canadians in the B's. You've got Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Birds Sing. You've got Jane Austen, who I absolutely adore as these lovely British almost comfort reads that people also recommended in my comfort read video. Emma, I think, is my favorite of those. Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy books hold a really special and fond place in my heart, as well as Martin Amis, who I just really like. Time's Arrow, as well as Money, and Zone of Interest, which actually made a better movie than a book, but he's just a really talented writer. For the science fiction heads, you've got Isaac Asimov, who is almost a brand name and legend in his own right, but for me, he's just a bit too old school, and I haven't read enough of him. I haven't actually read the Foundation trilogy, which is a personal sin, but he just has never really stuck with me as that interesting. I like the more modern speculative fiction, but if I had to choose one single author for A, it is going to be someone you probably haven't heard of. He's Canadian. His name is Andre Alexis, and I consider him to have accomplished the greatest feat in contemporary Canadian fiction, which is Quincunx Saga, which is 5 different books, each in a different genre. They interconnect into these really interesting philosophical ideas, and his most famous one of those is 15 Dogs, which is about dogs that are granted human level intelligence and are let loose in Toronto and discover the meaning of life. But I would say my favorite book out of all of these is this novel called Pastoral. It follows a priest who moves to a small town and his interactions with all the community members there. There's a lot of magical realism. He has a crisis of faith, and it's just a novel that just encapsulates so much of this existential yearning for meaning in life. It's absolutely beautiful. In the saga, there's Ring, which is this really lovely romance, which has a special place in my heart because I read it when I was falling in love with my now wife. I now have this ring on my finger from the last month. There's also The Hidden Keys, which is a little crime novel, Days by Moonlight, which is a wonderful little travelogue. But Pastoral was the first of all of the Quincunx books I read, even before 15 Dogs, the most celebrated. And it's just this beautiful pastoral ideal of Southern Ontario. It's a really wonderful novel, and I think all of these books really explore Southern Ontario as a setting, a place where I grew up and now live, and it's just a really beautiful series. I encourage you to check out Andre Alexis's Pastoral. All of the books in this series, I think they all work together really beautifully. They intersect and interrelate, and they're all very entertaining. They're very easy to read, but they have a lot of hidden depth to them. So Alexis is a really lyrical writer. I love this series, so check him out. But he is at the top of a very strong list, so check out all of those writers, and as always, put in the comments below who you think should be in the A's. I think B's were actually even harder than the A's because they contain some of my favorite writers of all time. Borges, who is probably the greatest short story writer of all time. These really precise thought experiments that explore fantastical ideas, Library of Babel, as well as Pierre Minard, author of Quixote, which is a really interesting exploration of a man who recopies all of Cervantes' Don Quixote and treats it as a whole new artistic work. And I spoke about this as one of my favorite pieces of fiction in my video on why AI can never create art. But Borges is incredible, as well as Roberto Bolaño, who is a Chilean poet and novelist. 2066 and The Savage Detective are some of my favorite novels of all time. They're just these wonderful, winding, labyrinthine, really long books that really encapsulate modern life. We also have Ray Bradbury, one of the consummate American storytellers, Fahrenheit 451, as well as The Illustrated Man, which I read as I think a tween or a really young teen, and that really got me into these speculative, magical stories that still hold a special place in my heart. And finally, The Sound of My Wife Screaming is because not in my top is Dionne Brand, who I consider Canada's greatest living writer. She's much better than Margaret Atwood as a novelist, as particularly as a poet, but I recommend all of her books. I find her just an incredible, very intelligent stylist. Theory is this beautiful academic satire, as well as Love Enough is this wonderful intersecting stories on love. She's a wonderful poet. The Blue Kirk and Ossuary. She also has a poetry collection of all of her poems that came out recently. I absolutely love her, but this is a game of favorites. And so as much as intellectually I respect her as an author, I find her incredible, Octavia Butler holds a special place in my heart as a speculative fiction author. I just find all of her books just are really reward revisiting. I find her characters so wonderfully full of depth. Her Parables of the Sower are just these wonderful dystopia novels which really predict a lot of the crises that we're going through now, that she just extrapolated from her experiences of dealing with racism and class in the US. But I think her novel Kindred is one of the greatest speculative fiction novels of all time. It's a time travel story which follows a black woman who is yanked from the 1970s back into the slave era times, and she just deals with the slave over son, tries to convert him away from the horrors of slavery, but it just deals with the concepts of guilt, responsibility, sin, betrayal, love, race, these really American themes in fantastic ways. Even her Xenogenesis series is this really interesting science fiction stories about what you would give up your freedom when humans are enslaved by this alien race, and just about what you would do to survive. All of them are really good, but Kindred I think is absolutely my favorite. So it's a very close tie. I think I would put Brand intellectually, for those who really want to explore a new author, above Butler, but just as a special place in my heart, Butler takes this by a very small margin of a hair. All right, we are into the C's, which is also quite a bit harder. We have one of my favorite discoveries of the year, which is Michael Crummey, who won the Dublin Fiction Prize this year, but I've read a few of his other novels, The Innocents and Sweetland, and they're these really wonderful, very specific stories about the Atlantic coast, Newfoundland in Canada. It's this place which only joined Canada in 1947. It's very heavy into fishing and has its own personal identity and accent. I think he just captures the people there so well. They're really wonderful and beautiful. And maybe if I've read a bit more of him, he would be at the top of this list, but I encourage you to check him out. There's also Albert Camus, who actually I'm much more of a fan of his philosophy than his novels. The Stranger as well as The Plague I enjoy, but I really like his L'Homme Révolté and then The Myth of Sisyphus. Really interesting explorations of absurdism. There's also Becky Chambers, who I absolutely adore. She got brought up a lot in my Comfort Reads video, which is really successful, but her Wayfarer series I really enjoy. And then there's also Robert Coover, who is I think one of the most underrated American writers, but his Imaginary Baseball League is one of my favorite cute little novels, and I really adore him. But if I had to give this to anyone, it is going to be a writer that I've mentioned several times in my video, and he's not even a novelist. It is Ted Chiang, who's one of the greatest science fiction short story writers of all time, and it would have to be Stories of Your Life and Others, his first really major collection. And I find him very similar to Borges, where he just takes an idea and really digs right through to it and just goes through everything. And so Stories of Your Life and Others is this whole examination of how language shapes reality. He's got another one which is about how the world would exist if, say, Jewish religion about homunculus was all true. He has another one about what if heaven and hell were real and you could see them. It's just a really interesting exploration of ideas. I love all of his stories. You should absolutely read him, as well as his other short story collection, Exhalation, which is almost as good, but Stories of Your Life and Others is one of the most perfect short story collections I've ever read. So he is my C choice. But again, it's a really, really stacked deck for this one. Next, we're on to the D's. And again, it's still loaded, but I promise this gets faster as we get further down the alphabet. But we've got some really, really heavy hitters here. We've got Azan Dumas, whose Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo, I think, are things that people really, really enjoy and are a touchstone for when I first got into really serious literature. As well, Edwidge Danticat, who's one of my favorite short story writers. I've talked before about The Dew Breaker as well as Crick Crack. She's a Haitian American writer, and I just think no one else is doing what she does. In the classics, you've of course got Dostoevsky, who I'm not as much of a Dostoevsky fan, even like the brothers Karamazov. I just find his characters to be too hysterical to really get into, though I know he's a touchstone for a lot of people, but not personally to my taste, but of course he has to have a mention. Don DeLillo also, who is a double D, and his White Noise is one of my favorite satires about modern culture, but I haven't been as big a fan of some of his other books, so he doesn't quite reach there. Also, in a Canadian context, you have the legend of Robertson Davies, who is just one of those seminal figures in Canadian writing, and he really brought this Canadian magical realism to the stage. But I also find he's more of a figure of an earlier candidate, which is very waspy, very white focused, and so he doesn't resonate as much with me as I think potentially he did with other people in the past. But he is one of those figures that people always talk to about really great Canadian literature. But you will have noticed I haven't talked about probably the most significant D, and that's because he's my number one. And it's going to be Charles Dickens. He is a legend for a reason. I just find his stories really, really entertaining. Even though he was paid by the words and they stretch and they sprawl, his characters are always really interesting. His knowledge about the social themes and his activism for social change are really great. And I think he's just one of the best namers of characters and creation of these side characters that will just give life to a whole novel. And it is hard to choose among my favorites, but I think David Copperfield, which is his almost semi autobiographical book, is just one of my most favorite ones. There's a lot of humor in it. It's just a really great coming of age story, and I think really shows Dickens among the top of his talents. But you could really choose so many Dickens, but he's going to be my top one just because he has lasted all this time for a reason. The E's here were a really fun one, and again, I have to show my bias because there's some really great intellectually rewarding readers and some ones that hold a special place in my heart. So you've got writers like Ralph Ellison, whose Invisible Man is one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, just about the emergence of the Black Power movement and Black nationalism and just all of those issues traced through this really evocative novel. You also have Annie Ernaux, who's a very deserving Nobel Prize winner, whose Passion Simple and also The Years I Read This Year, and just these really autobiographical books which really show French culture in the 20th century and just really transport you. I love her. George Eliot's Middlemarch is a classic for a reason, but throughout this list, there's a lot of authors who I've read one single work of theirs, which I consider amazing, but the authors that I really are my favorite and ones that I want to revisit are those that have multiple works. So I think with Ellison and with George Eliot, it's hard to really consider them my absolute favorites, even though I really admire their works. And then you've got writers like James Ellroy, whose American Underground trilogy is this great noir, dirty America series, which is about the JFK assassination and mobs, just really beautiful, hard-hitting prose, as well as one of my favorite fantasy authors when I was a kid, who's also Canadian, Stephen Erickson, whose Malazan Book of the Fallen I haven't picked up in over a decade, but I really enjoyed them while I read them, but not absolutely my favorite, because if we're going to choose an author that I really love to revisit, it's going to be Harlan Ellison, one of the most prolific and greatest short story writers of all time. And you could really pick up any of his collections and really enjoy them. I Have No Mouth and I'm a Scream is one of my personal favorites as a horror fan, as well as things like Jeff D Was Five, which is this really fascinating thing about a kid who doesn't age. Just any of his stories are really good. He just takes concepts and makes them really interesting and entertaining. His mind is just full of so many fantastic, entertaining stories. So if I have to revisit anyone, it's going to be Harlan Ellison. When we get to F, there's of course a clear favorite here, but there are so many good writers whose names start with F. Michel Faber, who's just one of the great novelists who just has so many different books, The Crimson Petal and the White, as well as a story about a missionary who goes to try to convert aliens, and he just follows so many different things, as well as Under the Skin, which may also a really great movie, but just doesn't quite click with me because the top one is absolutely the top. You have John Fowles with The Magus, which is one of my favorite books. I should do a whole video on that and reread it because it's one of those great coming of age books, which I think would actually help men much more than listening to Andrew Tate. It's just about how these gurus who say they treat you to how to be a full person are mostly just weird rip-off artists who are problematic in their own right. Just a really great twisty story. I absolutely love Fowls. And of course, an honorary mention to Frantz Fanon, who's one of the great post-colonial essayists. But again, I'm trying to focus on fiction. And if you're going to talk about F's and fiction, you have to talk about Elena Ferrante, and her Neapolitan novels are the greatest accomplishment of 21st century literature. She is just incredible at creating a whole setting of characters and letting all of Italy's history in the 20th century flow through them through this series. Days of Abandonment is a standalone novel, which also just highlights how good she is. I think it was only her second novel published under that name, and it was also just so full of characters and life. But you have to read the Neapolitan series. It's so seminal. It's so good. It encapsulates the growth of feminism, class, politics, just everything, the change of technology. If you're going to read anything out of this list, I will just recommend Ferrante because she is absolutely perfect as a writer. For G, if you'd asked me years ago who is my favorite, the answer would obviously be Neil Gaiman, whose stories I find really, really entertaining. But it has come out just how horrible he is and how much he's badly treated people. And so I just can never return to his stories with that same sense of awe and wonder. So he's not going to be in this list despite how talented he is as a writer, just because of how he is as a person. It has tainted his works for me because you can try to separate the art from the artist, but the artist always puts something of himself in the work, and so it will always just be too tainted for him to be my favorite, unfortunately. We've also got absolutely seminal writers like the science fiction writer William Gibson, Neuromancer, and all of those books are absolutely great, but they just connect more intellectually with me than emotionally, but he's an absolute touchstone. You've also got Graham Greene, who I've always found really entertaining as a novelist, but similar to Robertson Davies, he just feels too of the past for me and of this really mid-century white masculinity, which I find interesting, but not enough to be one of my favorites. So he's really interesting for those really wanting to explore Catholic themes. You also have Yaa Gyasi, whose Homegoing is one of my favorite novels of all time. A brilliant debut, but her second novel just didn't connect with me. So despite me loving the first one, her second one just takes her out of the list. So the last one, of course, has to be actually a French writer, who's Romain Gary. He's the only person to win the Prix Goncourt twice. You're only supposed to win it once, but he wrote well enough under pseudonym that he won it twice. And it was under that pseudonym that he wrote my favorite novel, which is La Vie Devant Soi, which is a really blackly humorous story about a kid growing up in a brothel, and it's just a really wonderful depiction of marginalized people in French society. He's a really fantastic writer. His prose is just so absorbing in French. Really, really love him, and he's very prolific. I have to read, I've only read 3 of his books, but I need to dive more into him. Just, I find all of his books so entertaining, and he led a really fascinating life. I should do a whole separate video on him because this video is already long enough, but check out Romain Gary. I think he's underappreciated in the Anglophone world and just an incredible writer. Under H, you have so many legends, of course. Ernest Hemingway, who is not my favorite, though of course I consider him an incredible writer. For Whom the Bell Tolls is probably my favorite work of his. You've got Zora Neale Hurston, you've got Victor Hugo, again one of those great French novelists. So have modern writers like Mohsin Hamid, whose Exit West is this really wonderful little novella which explores immigration and refugees and magical realism, though his other novels haven't quite hit as much. Reluctant Fundamentalist I don't consider particularly good. But if you have to have me pick a single H, it's actually going to be Nalo Hopkinson, who is this really wonderful, again, you'll notice a pattern, speculative fiction writer. She just explores interesting themes of Caribbean identity as well as science fiction, and the best encapsulation of that is, of course, Midnight Robber, which is just takes place on a Caribbean planet. It is one of the hardest reads because there is a lot of violence and trauma, but the main character overcomes this, and it's just this wonderful lush full of music and really wonderful themes I consider incredible, but also like Brown Girl in the Ring, The Salt Roads. She's just a really wonderful writer who's still with us, still writing, and she's just one that I will always revisit even over Hemingway. We're finally getting into some easier letters with I, which is basically between two writers, Ishiguro and Irving. John Irving, I've read a whole lot of his books. I always found them interesting. I think I just have really fond memories of A Prayer for Owen Meany, which I watched the movie of and then read the book. But all of his books tend to circle the same themes, so I find revisiting them isn't as interesting because the breadth isn't as large. But I think I'm going to have to go with Kazuo Ishiguro, who I just find a really fantastic novelist, mostly when he's doing historical books. I find his speculative fiction to be very good, but not as good as Remains of the Day, which is just this quintessentially British understated novel. Even if I haven't enjoyed his other books as much, Never Let Me Go is still very good. Clara and the Sun, not as good, but Remains of the Day is an absolute masterpiece, and of course, he's an incredible stylist. So, Ishiguro for I. J is also a bit easier. We've got Elfriede Jelinek, who I have read. She's a bit too trauma and hard of a read for me to really get into, but if you haven't picked her up her books in translation are actually really, really good. The person that they had translated them was just really full of this really funny, raw energy despite the really disturbing themes. There's also N.K. Jemisin, whose Broken Earth series is just an absolute touchstone, but I haven't liked as much of her other works, like the Living Cities series isn't as good, but her short stories are really good. She's excellent, but if I have to choose anyone, it's going to be Shirley Jackson, one of the greatest writers of all time. I just love the darkness in her work. I find her short stories to actually be the best. There's, of course, The Lottery, but The Summer People is this really great weird fiction horror. But if I had to choose any sort of novels, it would probably be The Haunting of Hill House. She's just a really great creator of mood. And if you just have to pick a J, it has to be Shirley Jackson. She's just great. Now, K is actually a bit more full than you would think. Of course, you have Stephen King, who I've read probably the most books out of anyone on this list. I did a whole video on why I love and both find Stephen King frustrating. I've read 25 of his books, and just for that reason, he's not going to be my favorite writer on here. You have Karl Ove Knausgaard, who's one of the heroes of, I guess, current modern literature, but I've read The Morning Star. I just find him too wordy. He doesn't really know what he wants to say. He's just writing to write, so it hasn't really hit me as much. You've got one of my favorite Hungarian writers, Laszlo Krasznahorkai, Melancholy of Resistance, as well as just a bunch of really dark comical books that I just really enjoy, but currently not at the top. And then I'm going to ruffle a few feathers and say that Kafka isn't really one of my favorite writers at all, really. I just don't find his stuff all that interesting. I've read a bunch of it, The Metamorphosis, The Castle, The Trial, and just he doesn't really do anything for me. I just find intellectually I sort of get it, but emotionally just I cannot connect to it, and it just doesn't do to me what I think novels should really do. So he's just never really put it all together for me. And I know that this is sort of a heretical thing, but yeah, just Kafka's never been for me, and it's a personal thing. I know a lot of people love him, but just never really connected with me. But who has connected with me is another Nobel Prize winner, and that is Han Kang. And I've really enjoyed all of her works. The Vegetarian is good, as well as her most recent one, which is Connection, which I can't remember, but just came out in translation. But if I have to pick anything, it's Human Acts, which is one of the greatest novels I've ever read. Like a lot of her books, it takes some of the problems in Korean society and it just really shows the horrors of trauma of this school massacre in 1980 when South Korea was still under a dictatorship. It follows this really interesting progression of people using the second person. Read this book. Kang is a really fascinating writer, and I think everyone should pick her up. Interestingly enough, L is not that full for me. So you have, of course, John le Carré, one of the great spy master novelists, which I always find very entertaining. Kelly Link is actually a really great short story writer. You have Audre Lorde, who's a great poet and essayist, but if you're going to choose an L for me, it's an author that I've just been reading recently, but she was in my top 10 from last year. If you've seen that video, when I've read one more of her works, that's Clarice Lispector, who is just one of the most talented stylists, even in translation. Her books are just these wonderful, muddy plays of language. I've read The Apple in the Dark and Agua Viva, which is more of a novella, and I'm going to choose, even though Apple in the Dark was in my top 10 last year, Agua Viva is just next level. It's this wonderful, almost like poetry novella, which just flows through this really sensual rhythm of milk and oysters and lust and love and yearning. And it's just, this flows much like living water, just beautiful, beautiful style. And I'm gonna probably read all of her works this year, just because a lot of them are short and a lot of them are just so good from what I read. So Clarice Lispector is mine. And now, halfway through the alphabet, we have M, which is probably my most populated of all these letters. Let me just, my list, I've got Norman Mailer, Somerset Maugham, Guy de Maupassant. They're really mentioned a lot, but they've never really done a whole lot for me. Same with Yugo Mishima, who a lot of people really love his books because they're really interesting stylistically and they really put his weird aesthetics of masculinity and fascism really in the work, and you really can't divorce him from that. For that reason, he's never really appealed to me because I just don't find that particularly interesting. I really like the movie, which is Mishima Life in Four Chapters, really examines that aesthetics, but as a writer, it's just never really appealed to me that much. It just sort of feels more one note, and I know that's sort of heretical, but again, these are my own personal beliefs. Have really done it for me. But you also have really great writers, like my favorite horror writer, Michael McDowell, who wrote the script for Beetlejuice, but also wrote one of my favorite horror novels of all time, The Elementals. You have Fernanda Melchor, who is a Mexican writer who wrote a really incredible book, Hurricane Season, which is really traumatic and hard to revisit, but is a feat of style, as well as Paradise, which is the second book, which is probably even more traumatic and not as my favorite, but I just can't revisit her because it is a really hard read, but I really respect her style, and it is just very emotionally resonant. The greatest writer among the M's is, of course, Toni Morrison. If you are objectively putting a list together, her place in American letters and her style and her just incredible emotional resonance of work, you would put her at the top of the list. But I just find her books are really hard to read because they're so full of so much pain. But I just consider her an incredible novelist. She's not going to be my favorite just because I find her books really hard to revisit, but I respect her so much. And if you were just putting a list of the best writers together rather than my personal favorites, she would absolutely be at the top of the list. Alice Munro, the great Canadian short story writer and Nobel Prize winner, is always going to be floating in these lists, and I really like her stories, but recently came out that she was a very terrible person. So again, it's hard for me to separate that and really consider one of my favorites, though I really do enjoy her work. But it is, again, just really hard to separate the art from the artist for me. And then the one person that I've not mentioned is Haruki Murakami, who's just never really done it for me. I don't identify with his works. I've mentioned this before. You can watch other videos to see my thoughts on Murakami. But that, of course, leaves the big unmentioned, which is Cormac McCarthy. And yeah, I really just like his works. The style and the bleakness of his work really fits. And even though it is these really violent and difficult and bleak books, I find them easier to revisit than Morrison just because it's not as traumatic, because it's almost a removal from the bleakness because the words are so spare. But that's for that reason my favorite book of his is not bleak. It's Setri, which is just a really comical, fun book full of really wonderful imagery and style, and is absolutely my favorite book of his because it is so un-McCarthy but still has so much wonderful prose stuff. So stay tuned and let's get into the first half of this really interesting list that I hope you enjoy. So that is the first half of the alphabet from A through M, each of my favorite authors for each letters, as well as some of the really significant runners-up. Please subscribe if you want to follow along for the other half of the list, as well as my other book reviews and book takes. It's been really great following along, and as always, please provide your comments about your own list, other authors that you think should be on the list or that should be number one, and I'll follow along and I will respond as much as I can, and I'll see you next time for the latter half of the list. Again, maybe some controversial takes, but this is again just celebrating all the wonderful things that you can get out of literature. I'll talk to you soon.